The train sliced through the countryside, its wheels humming a rhythmic lullaby against the tracks. Beyond the window, the English landscape unfolded in soft, familiar hues, rolling meadows, neatly divided by hedgerows, clusters of red-bricked cottages nestled among the trees. A timeless scene of tranquility. But tranquility, Miss Marple knew, was often an illusion. Behind lace-curtained windows, and within the prim, orderly streets of every village she had ever known, there lurked secrets, some buried deep, others waiting for the right moment to surface. And today, as she sat in her compartment, gloved hands resting lightly on her handbag, she had the peculiar feeling that Westfield-on-the-Green was no different. The train carriage rocked gently. Opposite her, a stout woman in an emerald green hat knitted industriously, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. At the far end of the compartment, a gentleman buried his nose in a copy of the Times, grunting occasionally as he turned the pages. It was a quiet journey, civilized, unremarkable, until now. A distant voice echoed through the corridor. Westfield-on-the-Green, next stop. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her expression betraying nothing. The game was about to begin. The station at Westfield-on-the-Green was precisely the kind of place where time seemed to move at its own unhurried pace. The platform was narrow, its wooden planks worn but well maintained. The station sign, though slightly faded, stood proudly against the soft backdrop of the countryside. A row of neatly arranged flower boxes lined the station house, their cheerful blooms adding an air of warmth to the morning light. Beyond them, the village itself lay in a postcard-perfect sprawl, thatched roof cottages, a church spire piercing the sky, and a single broad street leading into the heart of town. Miss Marple stepped down from the train with practiced ease, taking in her surroundings with the discreet attentiveness of a woman who never appeared hurried, but never missed a single detail. A handful of villagers had gathered, some awaiting passengers, others lingering as if the arrival of the morning train was the closest thing to entertainment they could expect. A young woman in a neatly pressed blue dress waved enthusiastically at a man further down the platform, her eyes alight with excitement. In contrast, an elderly gentleman tapped his walking stick impatiently, his sharp gaze fixed on the track as if expecting someone who had failed to arrive. Miss Marple was noticed, but not acknowledged, which suited her perfectly. People often revealed more when they believed themselves unobserved. She had just turned toward the station entrance when she was intercepted by a woman of ample proportions and an unfortunate hat adorned with an excessive number of artificial violets. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" The voice was rich with familiarity, though Miss Marple was quite certain she had never met its owner before. "I am Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw," the woman declared, patting Miss Marple's hand with the ease of someone accustomed to taking charge. "How delightful, Henrietta dear, from St. Mary Mead. You may not remember, but we met years ago at that charity garden party. You were wearing the most sensible hat I recall." Miss Marple, who had worn many sensible hats at many garden parties, smiled faintly. "Of course," she said graciously. "How very kind of you to meet me." Mrs. Bradshaw beamed, pleased with herself. "I could hardly let you arrive without a proper welcome. It's not every day we have such a distinguished guest." Then, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, she added, "Now let's get you settled. We shall take tea, and I will introduce you to the village, a lovely place, you'll find." Though, she hesitated, then leaned in further. One must know who to trust. Miss Marple's lips twitched ever so slightly. So that was how it was. As they walked from the station, Miss Marple observed the village with quiet interest. Everything was as it should be. The village green dotted with oak benches, the modest church at one end and at the other, a row of well-kept shops with neatly painted signs. But beneath the postcard-perfect charm, there was something else, a certain carefulness in the air. The butcher's wife, arranging flowers in a shop window, cast them a glance before turning away too quickly. The postman slowed his steps, as if considering whether to offer a greeting, before deciding against it. It was not coldness. Not exactly. More of a hesitation. Miss Marple had encountered this atmosphere before. It was the hush of a place waiting for something to happen, or perhaps, waiting for something to end. The confirmation came moments later. As they turned a corner, a pair of villagers, two women standing by the bakers, their heads close together in whispered conversation, glanced up at Miss Marple's approach. They fell silent. Their eyes flickered to Mrs. Bradshaw, and then, almost as one, they turned and hurried inside. Mrs. Bradshaw, unruffled, offered a tight smile. "As I said, dear Miss Marple, one must know who to trust." Miss Marple nodded politely, but said nothing. She had already seen all she needed to see. Something was very, very wrong in Westfield-on-the-Green, and whatever it was, she had just stepped into the middle of it. Women stationed outside the Millers dropped their voices just as she and Mrs. Bradshaw passed. The name they did not quite conceal was enough to set Miss Marple's mind in motion. Penrose. Alistair Penrose. Miss Marple filed it away, for later names were useful things. More useful still were the silences that surrounded them as they turned a corner. Mrs. Bradshaw exhaled as if debating something. Finally she said, "Alistair Penrose, a name you will hear often, though not from those who would rather forget him." Miss Marple did not press. She merely adjusted her gloves. "Shall we take tea first?" she said mildly. Mrs. Bradshaw nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, perhaps that would be best." And with that they disappeared into the village, the warmth of the summer sun doing little to dispel the tension in the air. Miss Marple, however, was quite accustomed to such things. After all, behind every peaceful village, there was always something waiting to be discovered. The cottage of Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw sat at the quieter end of Westfield-on-the-Green, a small but sturdy home with flower boxes under each window and ivy creeping up the brick in a polite but determined fashion. The lace curtains twitched as Miss Marple approached. A moment later, the front door opened before she had the chance to knock. "Dear," came the voice, thin but warm, "you've arrived safely. Come in, come in." Miss Marple stepped inside. House smelled of lavender and lemon polish with the faintest trace of cool dust from the morning's fire. A knitted shawl lay draped over the arm of a chair, a basket of half-finished wool beside it. Henrietta Bradshaw, once a woman of considerable energy, had grown smaller since Miss Marple had last seen her. Her once round face was sharper, her hands thinner, but her eyes were the same, sharp, watchful, and filled with that particular sort of fondness reserved for old friends. "You look very well, Henrietta," Miss Marple said gently. "I look dreadful, and you know it." Henrietta counted, patting her hair into place. "But no matter. You're here, and that's what's important." She ushered Miss Marple to a chair by the fireplace. "I've had cook put on a pot of tea. Something decent at last. The last few weeks have been unsettling." Miss Marple did not react at once. She merely reached for her gloves, pulling them off with the air of a woman who knew patience was the key to all things. Westfield-on-the-Green has always had its share of troubles, Henrietta continued, settling into her own chair with a sigh. But lately she hesitated. Miss Marple, well versed in the rhythms of village talk, knew better than to press. The words would come in their own time. "There's been a sort of nervousness in the air. You must have noticed it already." Miss Marple nodded. "People spoke in half sentences at the station, always a sign." Henrietta gave a small approving smile. "You always did see things others missed." She leaned forward slightly. "Must have heard of Alice Penrose." "I have," said Miss Marple evenly. "Then you know Henrietta," said her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He's dead." Miss Marple inclined her head as though this were a natural turn of conversation. Henrietta let out a dry laugh. "They haven't said so, but between you and me, Jane, there are ways of killing a man without ever lifting a hand against him." Miss Marple, who knew this to be true, said nothing. Henrietta exhaled, sitting back. "People are on edge. And there's Clarissa of course, his widow." "Yes, a remarkable woman in her own way, young, beautiful, and not nearly as devastated as one might expect," Miss Marple murmured. And then there's Dr. Lionel Croft. Miss Marple raised a brow. Oh yes, Henrietta continued with a pointed look. He's become quite the figure in Westfield, dashing, clever, charming when he wishes to be. He was Alistair's physician, though I dare say he acted more like a friend. And now with Alyssa gone, well, she let the words hang. Miss Marple reached for her teacup. And where does Harriet Monteith fit into this? Henrietta blinked, clearly impressed. You've been listening, I find it useful, said Miss Marple. Henrietta gave a satisfied nod. Harriet is Edgar Montague's daughter, the Tor, a kind girl. If a bit quiet, clever with the needle, of course, but lately she's been at the center of some very unpleasant talk regarding what? Regarding Alistair's death. Miss Marple took a careful sip of tea. Go on. Well, the whole business is unpleasant. They found Henrietta hesitated certain things in her cottage, things that suggested, well, that she might have had something to do with it. Did she? I can't imagine it, Henrietta said, shaking her head. But these days it's hard to say. People aren't themselves. Jane, everything feels wrong. Miss Marple studied her old friend. You suspect something, she said at last. Henrietta pressed her lips together, then nodded. I don't know what precisely, but something's amiss, and I want you to see for yourself. She reached for a small silver bell and rang it sharply. A few moments later, the door opened and a young maid entered. Would you be so kind as to let Mrs. Penrose know I'll be expecting her for tea tomorrow afternoon? Henrietta said. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. So the game had begun. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Henrietta took her hand. I know how these things work, she said quietly. You don't come to a place like Westfield on the Green just to visit an old friend. Miss Marple met her gaze. No, she admitted. I don't. Henrietta smiled. Good, then you'll do what you do best. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. We shall see. And with that she stepped outside, where the evening air was thick with the scent of roses and secrets waiting to be uncovered. The carriages had already begun arriving when Miss Marple reached Penrham Manor, its dark stone facade looming over the village like a silent judge. The house was old but well kept, its manicured hedges and polished brass fixtures speaking to generations of careful management. But wealth, Miss Marple had often observed, did not guarantee harmony. Within its walls she entered the great hall with Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw at her side, her manner composed, but her eyes quietly assessing the scene. The crowd was small, well-dressed and seemingly at ease, though Miss Marple had long since learned that appearances were the least reliable indicator of a person's true feeling. At the center of it all stood a list, Penrose, host and benefactor, nodding at each guest in turn. He was a tall man, a little too thin for his frame, with a sharp nose and keen, calculating eyes. Miss Marple, he said smoothly, as she and Henrietta approached, a pleasure. My wife spoke of your arrival. It is not often we are honored with visitors of your reputation. Miss Marple smiled. I have little reputation, Mr. P. Rose. I am merely a woman who listens. His expression flickered before returning to its customary confidence. Then I hope you will find something worth listening to here, he said, gesturing toward the room. Unraveled on the Green is a quiet place, but occasionally even quiet places have their stirrings. Miss Marple did not reply at once. Instead she observed the man before her. He was polite, certainly, but there was an impatience beneath his words. A mind perhaps burdened. Across the room, Clarissa Penrose stood near the fireplace, a glass of sherry in one delicate hand. She was younger than her husband, striking rather than beautiful, with a composed elegance that suggested both privilege and detachment. Henrietta leaned in. Do you see the way she holds her glass? Miss Marple glanced. Clarissa's fingers were curled lightly around the stem, not in relaxation but in distraction, the faintest tap of her nails against the glass betraying her thoughts. She's restless, Miss Marple murmured. She's indifferent, Henrietta corrected toward Eliezer. At least their marriage was never one of affection at that moment. Eliezer joined his wife, handing her a fresh drink with the automatic courtesy of a man long accustomed to playing the role of dutiful husband. I assume Dr. Croft will be arriving soon, he asked. Clarissa sipped her cherry. I assume so. The indifference in her voice was palpable. Miss Marple did not fail to notice the tension in Alistair's jaw. I don't like him, he said under his breath, though not quietly enough. Clarissa turned her head just slightly. So you've mentioned repeatedly, Henrietta exhaled. They quarrel often these days. Miss Marple nodded. Money, no doubt, or something worse. The evening drifted on in slow waves of conversation, the polite hum of a gathering where no one quite said what they meant. Miss Marple made her way to the terrace, stepping outside for a moment of cool air. She was about to return when she heard voices, a man's low and controlled and another more clipped. Alice Penrose. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that important things were never said in drawing rooms but rather in corridors, terraces and half-shaded corners where one was believed to be alone. She edged closer, pausing near the ivy-clad stone wall. You've made your position clear, came Eliza's voice. I have no intention of letting you swindle me. A brief silence. Then Dr. Lionel Croft's voice, steady, but carrying the unmistakable sharpness of a man unaccustomed to refusal. I'm offering you a way out. Penrose, you may think yourself untouchable, but even your name won't protect you when the truth comes out. A low chuckle from Eliza. A threat? I expected better from you. A warning, Croft corrected. A very expensive one, if you choose to ignore it. The conversation ended abruptly as footsteps sounded on the gravel. Miss Marple stepped back into the house, blending effortlessly into the gathering once more. She knew the sound of desperation when she heard it, and Dr. Croft, for all his refinement, was a man who had just revealed his own. The night had settled uneasily over Penrose Manor. The evening's polite conversation had dwindled, replaced by the sounds of glasses being set down and hushed farewells being exchanged somewhere in the distance. An owl called out, once, then fell silent. Miss Jane Marple had intended to leave soon. She had in fact just retrieved her coat when a sharp cry split the air. Not the high-pitched shriek of a maid, but something far rarer, fear. The house froze for a moment like a great animal catching the scent of something unnatural. Then footsteps thundered down the hall, voices overlapping in confusion. Miss Marple did not rush. Rushing rarely helped in these moments. She followed the commotion toward a heavy oak door, left slightly ajar. The study inside, the single glow of a desk lamp cast uneven shadow over the panel walls, and there, slumped in a leather armchair, was Eliza Penrose. His head lulled to one side, his mouth slightly open as though caught mid-sentence. The posture might have suggested sleep if not for the stillness. A deep, unnatural stillness. A hush fell over the room, save for the crackle of a dying fire. Standing just inside the door was Clarissa Penrose, one hand at her throat, her eyes wide and glassy pale, trembling. It was difficult to say whether it was grief or simple shock. Dr. Lionel Croft pushed past the gathering crowd, his polished boots clicking sharply against the floor. His usually composed expression had hardened into something unreadable. He knelt beside the chair, fingers pressing lightly against Alistair's wrist. Then his throat silence stretched. Then, with the heavy inevitability of a verdict being read, he said, "Is dead." A gasp from somewhere in the room. A maid stifled a sob. Clarissa swayed slightly. Croft glanced up at her. "You found him?" She nodded, but her voice failed. Her Miss Marple, unnoticed by most, watched closely, not at Alistair's body, nor at Dr. Croft, but at Clarissa herself. But the way her fingers twisted into the folds of her dress, the way she stared not at her husband, but at the empty space just beyond him. Miss Marple had seen grief before this. Wasn't quite it. Croft turned to the assembled guests. "Someone fetched the police." Henrietta Bradshaw hurried out at once, her mouth set in a grim line. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly over the room. "Where is Miss Monteague?" she asked almost idly. Harriet Monteague, the tailor's daughter, mentioned in whispers, was not among the horrified faces. She said she was stepping into the gardens. Clarissa murmured, regaining some composure. Her voice was low, detached. Miss Marple nodded, filing that away. A missing guest, a dead man, a room heavy with silence that held too many answers and yet none at all. Miss Marple stepped forward, her keen blue eyes taking in what the others missed. An out-of-place pen knife on the floor, near the desk, its blade half open, a curious thing. The sort of knife used to sharpen peels, not to kill. The sharp scent of cologne, lingering in the air, not Alistair's usual one, something heavier, more pungent. Miss Marple made a note of that. Scents could be terribly revealing. Scattered papers on the desk, some crumpled, others stained by an overturned glass of brandy. Financial records, it seemed. She noticed the name Dr. Lionel Croft on one of the pages, half obscured by a blot of ink. Dro turned, catching her eye. "You should step back, Miss Marple. This is an unpleasant business." She smiled almost kindly. "Or I expect it is, Doctor." She did not move. Outside, the first wail of a police whistle cut through the night. Harriet Montague's cottage sat on the edge of the village, small and tidy, its whitewashed walls clean despite the damp air. A neat row of merry girls lined the window boxes, a stark contrast to the tension that had settled inside. The search had begun 20 minutes ago, and already the place had been turned inside out. Drawers were upended, cushions displaced, a wardrobe left gaping open. The local constable, a nervous young man, hovered uncertainly near the door, while Sergeant Giles Parker, broad-shouldered and sure of himself, directed the officers with clipped efficiency. Miss J. Marple stood near the window, neither interfering nor unnoticed. Harriet Montague, small and sharp-eyed, stood rigid beside the dining table. Her hands were clenched at her sides, but her voice was steady. "There's nothing to find," she said. Sergeant Parker did not look up. He was a man who enjoyed certainty, and at the moment he had plenty of it. "That remains to be seen, Miss Mona." Then, with a sharp grunt of satisfaction, one of the constables emerged from the bed holding a small knife. It was unremarkable, except for the initials, HM, etched into the handle. A murmur rippled through the room. The penknife was placed on the wooden table next to a bundle of fabric threads, red, blue, and charcoal, clearly taken from a tailor's shop beside it. A folded letter, yellowed at the edges, was carefully smoothed out. Parker picked it up and read aloud. "You always think you can get away with it, Tate, but you won't. One day you'll pay for what you've done." The air in the room grew tight. Parker turned the letter toward Harriet. "This is in your handwriting." Harriet stepped forward, eyes wide. "That's a lie. I never wrote that. It's addressed to Mr. Penrose." Parker continued, tapping the paper. "Would you care to explain why?" Harriet swallowed, looking from the letter to the knife. Her expression shifted from shock to understanding, then fury. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "That's not my knife." Parker lifted an eyebrow. "It has your initials." "I've never seen it before," she said. Her voice had begun to tremble. "Miss Montague," Parker sighed, as though dealing with a particularly difficult child, "you worked for Mr. Penrose's household, did you not? You delivered orders for your father's shop." Harriet's jaw tightened. "I took measurements for his suits." "That is hardly a crime." Parker folded his arms. "It's enough to have given you access to him, to his study, and as it turns out, to the scene of his murder." Harriet pushed past the table, her breath coming faster now. "You think I—" She stopped, pressing a hand to her forehead. No, this is absurd." "Is it?" Parker leaned in. "A knife with your initials found in your bedroom. A letter suggesting hatred, and you conveniently missing when Mr. Penrose was last seen alive." "I was in the gardens," Harriet said, shaking her head. "No one saw you." "That doesn't mean I wasn't there." Parker folded his arms. The weight of the accusation was settling in now. Harriet took a step back, her throat tightening. "I didn't do this." No one spoke. She turned suddenly, looking at Miss Marple, the only person who wasn't treating her like a criminal. "Huh, you don't believe this, do you?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Belief is a strong word, my dear," she said kindly. The search continued, but Miss Marple was watching something else entirely. Sergeant Parker was making notes, his pencil moving swiftly over the pages of his small police ledger. The writing was neat, but too neat, as though he were being careful, deliberately measured. She had seen Parker's handwriting before. This was not quite the same, and that Miss Marple thought was very interesting indeed. She glanced again at the letter supposedly written by Harriet. The penmanship was oddly precise, a little too controlled, as though copied rather than naturally formed. Miss Marple had spent many years observing human nature, and something about this felt wrong. She studied Harriet, the panic on her face, not of guilt, but of someone caught in something beyond her control. Parker was speaking again, making the formal arrest. The words seemed almost rehearsed. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression unreadable. This wasn't an investigation, it was a performance. Performances, Miss Marple knew, were usually staged for an audience. The question was who had written the script. The Westfield on the Green police station was a modest affair, a single brick building with a wooden sign swinging on iron brackets. It smelled faintly of ink, pipe smoke and damp wool from the rain that had begun falling outside. Harriet Montague sat in a straight-backed wooden chair, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. She had stopped crying, though her face was still pale. She looked not like a woman guilty of murder, but like someone trying to understand how she had come to be in this position at all. Opposite her, Sergeant Giles Parker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes half-lighted. He had the air of a man who had already made up his mind. Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly in the corner, watched with polite interest. Parker tapped the penknife lying between them on the desk. "A weapon with your initials," he said slowly. "Found in your home." Harriet exhaled sharply. "I already told you I don't own that knife." Parker ignored the remark. "And then there's the letter," he continued. He unfolded the now crumpled note, reading it aloud. "Once more, you always think you can get away with it, but you won't. One day you'll pay for what you've done." He set it down with deliberate finality. Harriet stared at it. "That's not my handwriting." Parker made a vague noise of disbelief. "Is that so? Perhaps you wrote it in a moment of anger and forgot." Harriet's voice sharpened. "I don't forget things like that." Parker gave her a look he probably reserved for difficult children. "You had an argument with Mr. Penrose, didn't you?" Harriet blinked, startled. "I know I never argued with him." Parker smirked. "Then why have two separate people told me otherwise?" Silence. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly against each other as she studied the exchange. At last, Miss Marple spoke, her tone pleasant but firm. "Sergeant Parker, if I may." Parker looked up as if remembering she was there. Yes, Miss Marple." She smiled kindly. "I am an old woman and my memory is perhaps not what it once was, but I believe I heard Mr. Edgar Montague mention that Harriet was in his shop around the time of Mr. Penrose's murder. Am I mistaken?" Parker hesitated. Harriet sat forward, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Yes, I was helping my father. I was delivering a tailored coat to the Vic's house." Miss Marple nodded. "And the Vicar's house is on the opposite end of the village, isn't it?" Harriet turned to Parker. "Ask the Vicar's housekeeper. She saw me there. I knocked on the door myself." Parker cleared his throat, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something in his face. A moment of doubt. He masked it quickly. "He look into it," he said, tone dismissive. Miss Mar's knitting continued, its steady rhythm. "I'm sure you will." The door swung open then, and Dr. Lionel Croft stepped in. He had removed his gloves, which he now held in one hand. He was calm, composed, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that suggested he was calculating each word. "Before speaking, Parker," he said smoothly, "you need anything further from me?" Parker shook his head. "Your statement was thorough." Dr. Croft gave a gracious nod. Then he turned toward Harriet. "Miss Montague," he said with an air of deep sympathy, "this is all very unfortunate." Harriet did not respond. Miss Marple, however, noted something odd. He had chosen his words carefully. Not unjust or unfair, just unfortunate. Croft turned to Parker. "I know you're thorough, Sergeant, but surely the investigation should consider other angles. A young woman like Harriet, would she really have done this alone?" Parker frowned. "You have someone in mind?" Dr. Croft shrugged, as though reluctant to say. Then, as though deciding, he sighed. "Mr. Edgar Montague," he said, "Harriet's father." The man is in debt, is he not? And he would have had access to Alistair's study when delivering suits. Harriet's head snapped up. My father had nothing to do with this. Croft held up a calming hand. I mean no harm, Miss Montague, but facts must be considered. Mustn't they? Miss Marple's knitting slowed. Dr. Croft was deflecting Harriet's distress, had made her an easy target. But now Croft was subtly redirecting suspicion onto Edgar Montague, an opportunist looking to shift blame, and Miss Marple, watching it all quietly, took note. Something in this room was very wrong. The village tea room was a picture of quiet civility, with its neatly pressed tablecloths, silver-plated sugar tongs, and soft murmur of conversation. The scent of freshly brewed tea and warm scone curled through the air, lending the illusion that all was right in the world. Miss Jane Marple stirred her tea without hurry, her sharp blue eyes drifting lazily across the room to the untrained observer. She might have seemed like nothing more than an elderly lady, indulging in her afternoon refreshment. But Miss Marple was listening. In villages, such as Westfield on the Green, the tea room was more than a place for light refreshments, it was a hub of information, where news was passed from table to table in hushed tones, half-truths, and the occasional outright fabrication. And at the moment the topic of discussion was Eleazar Penrose at the next table. Mrs. Bellamy, the butcher's wife, lowered her voice conspiratorially. I tell you there's money missing, she whispered. Missing? Her companion and Mrs. Graves gasped. You mean stolen? Well, that's just it, Mrs. Bellamy said. Alice Penrose wasn't the sort to misplace money, and yet there were whispers that something wasn't quite right with his accounts, and who, might I ask, had access to them? Miss Marple did not look up, but her mind immediately filled in the answer. Dr. Lionel Croft. Oh, but Dr. Croft's a respected man, Mrs. Gray said uncertainly. Mrs. Bellamy sniffed. Respected by whom? The man came into money too quickly for my liking. Investments, he said. But what sort of investments? Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea. Embezzlement. The word had not been spoken aloud, but it was there, hovering like a ghost between the lines at another table. A pair of seamstresses from the tailor shop were engaged in their own murmured discussion. Miss Marple adjusted her seat, ever so slightly, catching snippets of their conversation. And Edgar Montague's been keeping to himself more than usual. Well, you know how it is. He owed Alice Penrose money, a great deal of it. I heard people do strange things when debts pile up. Miss Marple tapped her teaspoon lightly against her saucer. Debts? Could Edgar Montague have forced Harriet into something desperate? Or worse, had someone else forced his hand? She let the question linger in her thoughts until a sudden voice cut through the background noise. Miss Marple. A young voice piped up. She turned to see a freckled-faced boy, no older than 12, shifting nervously by her table. Forgive me, miss, but I thought, maybe you ought to know. Miss Marple smiled gently. Go on, dear. The boy lowered his voice. I saw Sergeant Parker sneaking away from Harriet Montague's cottage late one night, just the day before the police found all that evidence. Miss Mar's fingers paused on the handle of her teacup. That was very interesting. Indeed, the Montague key shop was small. The air thick with chalk dust, pressed wool and worn leather. Bolts of fabric were stacked neatly against the walls, and the rhythmic clatter of a sewing machine echoed from the back room. Miss Marple entered, and Edgar Montague, a thin, harried-looking man, turned quickly. His eyes darted toward her, then to the closed door behind her, as if expecting trouble to follow. Miss Marple, he said, voice tight. I assume this isn't a social call. She smiled pleasantly. Oh, but social calls can be quite illuminating. Mr. Montague. He hesitated, then gestured for her to sit his hands. Miss Marple noted, trembled slightly, as he reached for the teapot. Harriet is innocent, he said abruptly before she could speak. His hands curled into fists on the table. I swear it, whatever they found in her room, it wasn't hers. Miss Marple studied him. You seem quite sure of that? Edgar reached into a drawer and pulled out a small penknife. It was nearly identical to the one the police had discovered in Harriet's room except for one detail. The real one, he said quietly. Harriet's actual knife, she left it here days ago, that thing. They found it was planted. Miss Marple took the knife, turning it over in her hands. A replacement, a forgery. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame Harriet. She looked up at Edgar. Who would want to do such a thing? Edgar hesitated. His fingers drummed once against the table. Then he exhaled. Alistair. And I owed him money. How much? He swallowed. More than I could pay. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did he threaten you? Edgar shook his head. Not directly, but I knew the time would come when he'd demand something in return. Miss Marple let the silence stretch between them. Watching Edgar carefully leverage over you, she said at last. Edgar's fingers curled inward. Yes. Did he have leverage over others? A flicker of something crossed his face. Miss Marple tilted her head. Perhaps over someone like Doggett Croft. Edgar inhaled sharply. You know not everything, she said mildly, but enough. Edo rubbed a hand over his face. I overheard them. Alistair and Croft. An argument. 3 days before the murder. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Croft was furious. He said. Edgar hesitated. He said, you ruin me if you speak a word of this, and if you do, Penrose, I promise you won't live to regret it. Silence. Miss Marple folded her hands. Dr. Croft had made a threat, and now Alistair Penrose was dead. Edgar exhaled, looking at her helplessly. I swear to you, Miss Marple, I didn't kill him, and neither did Harriet. Miss Marple patted his hand gently. I rather think, she said, her voice light but firm, that you are telling the truth. She stood up, tucking the real penknife into her handbag with the ease of a woman who had just completed an intricate piece of embroidery. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of the mystery settled around her like a shawl. She considered all she had learned, the rumors of embezzlement, the false evidence planted in Harriet's home, the suspicious eagerness of Dr. Croft to shift suspicion elsewhere, and most importantly, the chilling threat Alistair had received days before his murder. Miss Marple adjusted her hat with precise fingers. The pieces were beginning to take shape. The local constable's office was a cramped, dimly lit room tucked behind the village hall, its shelves lined with dusty ledgers and case files that hadn't been disturbed in years. The air smelled of ink, old paper, and damp wool from a coat left too long by the leaking window. Miss Jane Marple, seated neatly on a hard wooden chair, folded her hands in her lap and observed the young man in front of her. Constable Robert Finch, no older than 24, had the nervous air of a man unused to speaking his mind in official matters. He cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, avoiding her gaze. Sergeant Parker has been quite thorough in his handling of the case, he said stiffly, but there was something just a little too forced in his tone. Miss Marple smiled kindly. A commendable quality in a policeman, she murmured. Finch hesitated. Then, as if unable to resist the warmth of her expectant expression, leaned forward and lowered his voice. Truth be told, ma'am, I've had my concerns. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Finch exhaled slowly. I've been stationed here 6 months. Parker arrived just before me, but I heard things from his last posting. Miss Marple tilted her head, her interest sharpening. And what did you hear, dear? Finch swallowed. He wasn't exactly scrupulous. There were rumors of bribery, nothing proven, of course, but in some cases he handled. Evidence went missing. Charges were dropped. Miss Marple listened, her expression mild, though her mind was piecing together the information with precise efficiency. And now? She prompted gently. Finch hesitated again, then leaned in slightly. Lately, I've been uneasy about how quickly he settled on Harriet Montague as the killer. He pushed her guilt too quickly, too confidently. Miss Marple considered this, her fingers tapping lightly on the handle of her handbag. And what do you think? Finch looked conflicted. Then in a whisper, I don't think Harriet killed Alistair Penrose. He swallowed. But Parker, he seems awfully set on making sure everyone believes she did. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. With great care she placed it on the desk, smoothing it out. It was a copy of Parker's handwritten report, detailing the so-called evidence found at Harriet Montague's cottage. Finch frowned. What about it? Miss Marple tapped a delicate finger against the signature at the bottom. Have you ever noticed, she said conversationally, how a person's handwriting changes depending on their mood? Finch blinked. Miss Marple withdrew a second paper from her bag, and here, she continued smoothly, is a different document Sergeant Parker wrote only a week prior. Finch's brow furrowed as he looked between them. The first signature was bold, sharp, the strokes deliberate. The second was different, not just in slant, but in pressure, in rhythm. The same name, yes, but not the same hand. The implication settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Finch paled. Someone else wrote this report. Miss Marple nodded, standing. Yes, she said lightly. It would seem so. The local inn, a squat brick building near the village green, was quiet that evening, save for the low murmur of patrons finishing their drinks. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls, and the scent of ale and damp wood filled the air. Miss Marple entered unobtrusively, gliding rather than walking, and took a seat in a shadowed corner. She had no intention of ordering anything. She was here for one reason only. Sergeant Parker sat near the fireplace, hunched over a glass of whiskey. His thick fingers drummed idly against the tabletop. His uniform was slightly rumpled, his expression grim. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flickered to the door every time it opened, as if he were expecting something or someone. Interesting. She waited, patient as ever, until the moment was right. Then, adjusting her lace gloves, she stood and walked towards his table. Sergeant Parker, she said pleasantly. He stiffened. Miss Marple, she gestured toward the empty seat opposite him. Might I join you? For a moment he hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. Miss Marple sat gracefully. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her expression one of polite inquiry. It's been quite the eventful few days, hasn't it? Parker snorted, taking a long sip of whiskey. That's one way to put it. Miss Marple studied him, the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hand as he set the glass down, the way his jaw clenched just a fraction too tight. Tell me, Sergeant, she said mildly. Do you believe in justice? Parker's eyes snapped to hers, something flickering behind them, something wary. Of course I do, he said, but the words rang hollow. Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. How reassuring. She leaned forward just a little, voice gentle, almost conspiratorial. You see, I rather think someone has been very clever, Sergeant Parker, and I do so enjoy cleverness. She tilted her head. But cleverness, when used improperly, has a way of unraveling itself. Wouldn't you agree? Parker's fingers tightened around his glass. Miss Marple simply smiled. Ah, she said softly. I thought you might. And with that she settled back, quite content. The trap was set. Now it was only a matter of waiting. Whiskey, his face pale and drawn, his fingers tapped nervously against the rim, and he was speaking in a low, urgent tone to someone on the telephone. Miss Marple did not mean to overhear, but as it happened she did. I told you I handled it. Parker muttered. A pause. Miss Marple strained to catch the reply, but whoever was on the other end was speaking too softly. Then Parker's voice rose slightly, Asian creeping in. I'll keep my mouth shut for now. But another pause. Parker tensed, gripping the receiver tighter. If this goes any further, you won't just have the police to worry about. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers twitched slightly against the hem of her sleeve. Whoever was on the other end of that line was not Sergeant Parker's superior, and Parker was afraid the call ended. Parker sat for a moment staring at the glass in front of him. Then with a deep breath he stood and came face to face with Miss Marple. "Oh dear," she said pleasantly. "What a coincidence." Parker's entire body stiffened. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a tight smile. "I didn't see you there." She smiled. "Few people ever do." Parker shifted, clearly uneasy. "Something I can help you with?" "Perhaps," she said, tilting her head. "You see, I happened upon some rather curious information today about your reports, about how one might charge a document if one were so inclined." Parker's jaw clenched. "That's absurd." "Is it?" she said lightly. A tense silence stretched between them. Parker looked away first. He grabbed his coat too quickly, as though eager to be anywhere. "But there, it's late. Miss Marple, you should go home." Miss Marple simply watched him. "A good night's rest can be very revealing, Sergeant." His eye twitched just slightly. Then without another word he turned and strode out into the cold night. Miss Marple did not move. She had seen that particular sort of retreat before, not the flight of a guilty man, but of a trapped one, and trapped men were dangerous. She gathered her things, her mind turning. Someone had Sergeant Parker's leash, and she intended to find out who was holding it. Miss Jane Marple was stirring her morning tea when the cottage door burst open. Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw, usually composed even in times of mild calamity, stood in the doorway, breathless and pale, clutching a shawl about her shoulders. "Jane, it's terrible," she gasped. "Sergeant Parker dead." Marple sat down, her teaspoon without a sound. "Dead," she repeated, her voice mild. "His motor car. They found it overturned on Moorland Lane at dawn. The constables there. Now they say he lost control in the dark." Henrietta pulled her shawl tighter, as if warding off the thought. "Awful business. The roads out there are treacherous." Miss Marple reached for her coat. "Yes," she said quietly. "Treacherous indeed." Moorland Lane was a narrow, twisting road, flanked by thick hedge, RS, and drops, that could send an unlucky driver tumbling into a ditch or worse. Parker's motor car done just that. It lay on its side fronts, smashed against an old oak. A single headlamp still flickered weakly, its light casting uneasy shadows across the early morning. The constable, Robert Finch, stood near the wreck, speaking in low tones with the village doctor. A few villagers had gathered, keeping a respectful but curious distance. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression polite but intent. Dr. Howard Beckett, a serious-looking man, with a sharp nose and a permanent scowl, straightened as she approached. "Terrible thing," he muttered, glancing at the wreckage. "Poor fellow must lost control. The road slick in the mornings." Miss Marple peered through the broken driver's window. Parker was slumped against the steering wheel, unmoving. His face was ashen, his collar slightly askew. A smear of dried blood traced down from his temple, though there was no major wound visible. She glanced at Finch. "Did anyone witness the accident?" The young constable shook his head. Miss Marple, a farmer, passing by, spotted the wreck at first light. "Parker must have been out late." Miss Marple nodded absently. Her sharp eyes scanned the vehicle. The road here was indeed treacherous, but Parker was a steady driver, not prone to reckless speed. Then she noticed something. The chassis just near the front wheel were fresh scratches on the brake line, thin, deliberate looking. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. She straightened and turned to Dr. Beckett. "Could you say, doctor, that the late Sergeant Parker was in excellent health?" Beckett frowned at the odd question. "He had no known ailments, if that's what you mean." "No signs of illness last night?" Beckett hesitated. "None, that I saw." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Someone had ensured that Parker never spoke again, and they had made it look like an accident. She turned to Finch. "Constable, I think we ought to examine the body more closely. There may be something we've overlooked." Finch paled slightly, but nodded. Miss Marple stepped back, mind already sorting through the possibilities. Someone had silenced Parker. Now she just had to determine who had pulled the strings. The news of Sergeant Parker's death spread quickly through Westfield. On the green, by midday, the once gentile murmurs in the tea room had turned into hushed but frantic speculation. Panic was not the usual way of things here, but neither was a series of untimely deaths. Miss Jane Marple strolling through the village in a fashion that seemed unhurried, but was anything but noted. The subtle shifts in behavior. Mrs. Bellamy, who had never been known to lower her voice now, spoke in whispers outside the butcher's. The vicar's wife, usually so fond of lingering gossip, kept her head down, rushing past with her shopping basket. A few shops had closed early, their proprietors muttering about bad luck. And then there was Clarissa Penrose. The widow of Alice Penrose had in the days following his murder kept up appearances, walking the streets with composure, accepting condolences with distant politeness. Now she had vanished from public view entirely. Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw, who had appointed herself the village's central hub of information, confirmed it over tea that afternoon. "She's locked herself away in that great cold house," Henrietta said, setting down her cup with more force than necessary. "Even the staff have been dismissed, at least, most of them. Only the housekeeper remains." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "A sudden change of heart, or self-preservation?" Henrietta sniffed. "She was never sentimental. I imagine she's thinking quite seriously about what happens to a widow of means when two men have now died in such unfortunate circumstances." Miss Marr's teacup clinked gently against the saucer. "Two deaths," she said thoughtfully. "One expected, the other inconvenient." Henrietta frowned. "Inconvenient?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "For those who benefited from Parker's certainty, yes. Harriet Montague, for instance. The tailor's daughter had been all but condemned, yet now the man most eager to see her charged lay dead in a ditch." Miss Marple had seen many things in her lifetime. Coincidences were rarely among them. That evening she sat in the quiet of her cottage, examining her collection of seemingly unrelated details. A dead man, a panicked widow, a young woman freight AED, a doctor with a past, and now she had something new. Constable Finch, still unnerved by the discovery of Parker's tampered brake line, had allowed Miss Marple a few discreet moments with the sergeant's belongings. Among them were his gloves stiff with dried mud, but at the fingertips tiny flecks of metal. Miss Marple turned them over in her hands, feeling the faint residue between her fingers. She had seen this before, not in the hands of policemen, but of mechanics, and there was only one man in the village known for his mechanical hobbies. Dr. Lionel Croft. Parker's jacket pocket had also yielded something else, a folded receipt, hastily crumpled, a large cash withdrawal dated 2 nights before his death. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Parker had been nervous, desperate, even had he been bought off, or worse, had he attempted to buy his own safety. She sat back, a finger against her chair's arm. Alice Penrose had been killed for a reason. Parker had been killed for knowing too much. And somewhere in between, Dr. Croft had slipped under everyone's notice. Miss Marple smiled to herself. She doubted that would last much longer. The Westfield on the Green Library was a small musty room tucked between the village hall and the post office. It had a peculiar silence, the sort that settled in places where knowledge was kept but rarely disturbed. Miss Jane Marple entered with her usual unassuming air, pausing to admire the neat rows of books. It was a habit, one that disarmed people. The less threatening she appeared, the more people revealed behind the counter. Miss Lucy Mann, the librarian, glanced up. A thin bird-like woman. Lucy had the habit of folding her hands tightly, as if perpetually bracing herself. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dear, I was hoping for your assistance," Miss Marple said kindly, approaching the desk. Lucy nodded, visibly uneasy, but led her to a back table. Miss Marple took a seat as the librarian retrieved a stack of old newspaper clippings, their edges yellowed with time. "These are from 3 years ago," Lucy said, setting them down, "about Mr. Penrose's medical adventure." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and scanned the headlines. promising future Penrose and Crofts Medical Research Fund gains investors. Uncertainty looms. Delays in Penrose and Crofts' initiative raise questions, and then a peculiar mention of financial discrepancies. Miss Marple tapped a paragraph lightly. An undisclosed sum believed to be in the thousands remains unaccounted for. Dr. Croft assures investors the matter is being handled. How she glanced at Lucy. Did you know Mr. Penrose? Well, Lucy hesitated, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her sleeve. No, she murmured. But I heard things. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. What sorts of things? Dear Lucy's eyes darted toward the door. That night, when Mr. Penrose died, I was passing by the manor. Miss Mar's knitting needles clicked softly as she listened. I heard voices. Lucy whispered, raised voices. Miss Marple kept her expression neutral. And what did they say? Lucy swallowed. I heard someone shout the word embezzlement. And then there was silence. Miss Marple folded her hands. Seemed Mr. Penrose's troubles had caught up with him, and perhaps Dr. Croft had made sure they wouldn't be spoken of again. Dr. Lionel Croft's surgery sat on the far end of the village, a modest but well-kept building. The brass plate by the door gleamed polished. Daily appearances mattered to men like Croft. Miss Marple knocked lightly. A moment later, the door opened and Dr. Croft stood before her, his smile carefully measured. Miss Marple, he said smoothly. A pleasure. What brings you? She smiled. I'm afraid I've been feeling rather run down. Croft's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes flickered. Of course, he said. Do come in. The surgery was tidy with polished instruments and precisely stacked files. Miss Marple sat primly as Croft took her wrist, counting her pulse. Any trouble sleeping? He asked. Oh, I sleep quite well, Miss Marple said pleasantly, though I imagine poor Mr. Penrose didn't. Toward the end, Croft's fingers stilled on her wrist. A terrible loss, he said smoothly. Did he suffer from any ailments? Croft's grip tightened just slightly. None of note. Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh, but I heard he was being prescribed something, said Ative. Was it? Croft's entire body went still for half a second. Then he exhaled a short laugh. You must have heard wrong. A man like Alistair wouldn't need such things. Miss Marple said nothing, just watched and coughed for the first time, looked away. First he stood quickly, moving to his desk. If you like, I can recommend something for your fatigue. Miss Marple folded her hands. Dr. Croft, she said mildly. What do you suppose happens when a man discovers he has been swindled? Croft's hand froze on a draw handle. Miss Marple, he said, voice calm, but too careful. Are you accusing me of something? She smiled, serene. I've accused no one, dear, though I do wonder when debts are high. People sometimes act rashly. Croft's face had gone tight. I should hope you choose your words carefully, madam. Oh, always, she assured him. Words are rather important, don't you think? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes drifted past the open surgery door to a side room where a neatly arranged workbench stood against the wall. Croft followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. You enjoy mechanical work, doctor? He nodded. A hobby. I like precision. Miss Marple's eyes rested on a set of fine metal tools, perfect for adjusting brake lines. She looked back at Croft, her expression mild. Imagine you do. And with that she took her leave, stepping out into the cold afternoon air behind her. Croft watched her go, his jaw eyelid. Miss Marple had what she needed. Now she only needed to set the trap. Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw's parlor was warm and inviting, filled with the soft chime of porcelain, teacups and the scent of freshly baked biscuits. Yet despite the coziness of the setting, there was a tautness in the air, an invisible thread pulling each person to the edge of their composure. Miss Jane Marple sat at the head of the table, her knitting resting idly in her lap. She had gathered them all here for a reason. Dr. Lionel Croft, seated stiffly to her right, was the picture of controlled composure, though his fingers drummed lightly against his knee beside him. Clarissa Penrose, widow of the deceased, kept her back straight, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. Her face was carefully neutral, but her eyes flickered with something close to weariness. Across from them sat Harriet Montague, pale but defiant. Her father, Idar Montague, rested a protective hand on her shoulder. The tailor looked thoroughly wrung out, as if the weight of weeks of suspicion had drained him. And then there was Lucy Maitland, the librarian, sitting as small and silent as a trapped bird. Mrs. Bradshaw, ever the gracious host, poured tea with an unspoken understanding that no one would actually drink it. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "I do appreciate you all coming." No one spoke. Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her gaze was sharp as she surveyed the room. "Now," she said, her tone light yet deliberate, "let us discuss murder." She folded her hands on the table, her manner as if discussing a particularly tricky knitting pattern. "It all began, of course, with the unfortunate death of Alistair Penrose, a man of means and secrets. He was found in his study, slumped in his chair. His widow, Mrs. Penrose, discovered him, though I dare say she was not particularly griefs." Clarissa's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued. "The matter became more troubling when Harriet Montague was accused. A knife conveniently found in her home, coupled with a falsified letter of supposed resentment, led the police to believe she had reason to kill him." Harriet let out a small shuddering breath. Edgar squeezed her hand. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod in their direction before pressing on. "And then, of course, Sergeant Parker met an unfortunate end. A tragic accident, they called it, though it was rather too convenient, wasn't it?" The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple's tone softened. "A man who was so certain of Harriet's guilt, then suddenly gone before he could be questioned properly. A strange coincidence." Indeed. Lucy Mayland shifted uneasily, her teacup rattling against its saucer. Dr. Croft cleared his throat. "This is all very dramatic, Miss Marple, but surely you have more than theatrics." Miss Marple beamed at him. "Oh, certainly, let's discuss evidence." She turned her attention to Harriet. "My dear," she said gently but firmly, "the knife found in your home, it was not yours." Harriet blinked. "I told them that." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but men like Sergeant Parker are fond of their conclusion. T.S." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small familiar knife. "The real knife." Edgar let out a small gasp. "That's Harriet's. Her actual knife. I kept it in my shop the entire time." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. Which means the one found in Harriet's home was planted by someone who wanted the investigation to end quickly." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. Harriet's shoulders shook. The weeks of fear of being watched, of whispered accusations. It was over. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not hide them. "Then I really didn't," she trailed off, voice breaking. Miss Marple patted her hand. "No, my dear, you didn't." A soft murmur rippled through the room, but Miss Marple was not finished. She turned her attention back to the group, her gaze sharpening. "The real question, of course, is who did." The parlor fell into silence, the only sound the soft tick of the mantel clock. The fire crackled its warmth at odds with the tension in the air. Miss Jane Marple, still seated with her hands folded neatly in her lap, cast a gentle but unwavering gaze over the room. Miss Aileel coughed, usually composed, sat unnaturally still, his jaw tightened ever so slightly, though his expression remained blank. Clarissa Penrose, the widow, had gone paler than before, her fingers tightening on the fabric of her skirt. Lucy, Mand and the Montagues watched with wide eyes, waiting for the final thread to be pulled. Miss Marple smiled kindly but firmly. "Dr. Croft," she said, "this has been quite an ordeal for all of us, but I believe the ordeal is at its end." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "It was a rather complicated crime, wasn't it?" she began conversationally. "One that required careful planning, a keen mind, and a certain level of desperation." Dr. Croft said nothing. Miss Marple continued, as if he had agreed. "Alistair Penrose was a shrewd businessman, But he was not always careful about whom he trusted. She tilted her head slightly. He entered into a financial venture with you, Dr. Croft. Medical enterprise meant to secure a great deal of investment. Clarissa let out a breath, as though hearing a truth she had long suspected, but never confirmed. Miss Marple folded her hands. But the numbers didn't add up, did they? She mused. A large sum of money simply disappeared. The silence stretched. Alice, being a careful man in some respects, began asking questions, and those questions led him straight to you, Dr. Croft. A flicker of something crossed Croft's face. Annoyance. Perhaps. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I expect at first you tried to talk him down. Perhaps you convinced him. It was all a misunderstanding. But Alyssa wasn't a fool, was he? He kept pressing. Dr. Croft exhaled through his nose. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost gentle. You must have realized there was only one way to prevent him from exposing you after all. Embezzling is one thing, but being caught, that would have ruined you. She let the words hang before continuing. And so you did what men of intelligence often do. When cornered, you removed the problem. Clarissa let out a quiet gasp. Miss Marple's voice did not waver. You poisoned him. Dr. Croft's hands clenched just slightly. Miss Marple turned toward Harriet, Montague, and then of course there was the issue of blame. Harriet sat very still, watching Miss Marple with something close to disbelief. Miss Marple gave a small nod in her direction. Dr. Croft, you're a clever man. You knew it wouldn't be enough to kill Alistair. You needed a culprit, one who would be easily dismissed by society. She turned to Edgar Montague. No offense, dear. Edgar swallowed hard. Miss Marple smiled again. And so you enlisted the help of Sergeant Parker. Lucy. Mond let out a small strangled sound. Oh, Parker didn't know everything. Of course, Miss Marple said. Men like him never do. But you must have paid him handsomely to place that penknife in Harriet's room. Harriet shook her head, tears forming the thread from the tailor shop. Miss Marple added a small but deliberate touch. You didn't just want to accuse her. You wanted the evidence to be irrefutable. Dr. Croft exhaled sharply through his nose as if growing weary of the performance. And Parker, Miss Marple continued, was happy to do it. That is, until he realized what sort of game he was truly playing. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. Parker was a man of limited intelligence, but an abundance of self-preservation. When he began to suspect that he was a pawn in something far bigger, he did the one thing all greedy men do. When cornered, she met Dr. Croft's eyes. It tried to bargain. Dr. Croft's jaw twitched. Miss Marple did not break eye contact. I imagine he called you that night. Didn't he told you he wanted more money? Perhaps even hinted that he would go to the authorities if you didn't comply. The room was still. Miss Marple's voice remained quiet and unshaken. And so you took care of him. You tampered with his car. A small but precise adjustment, easily overlooked. A little too much wear on the brake line. She smiled softly. After all, Dr. Croft, you do enjoy mechanical work. Dr. Croft stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's enough, he said coldly. Miss Marple remained seated, entirely calm. I quite agree, she said. Constable Finch stepped forward from the doorway. Dr. Croft's face darkened. The room seemed to exhale as the weight of the truth settled over them. Clarissa looked down at her hands, exhaling slowly. Harriet let out a quiet, shaky sob, the burden finally lifting, and Miss Marple, ever composed, reached for her tea. Justice, she murmured, taking a small sip, is always best served warm. For a long moment after Miss Marple's quiet revelation, there was only silence, the kind that settles just before a storm. Then the room exploded. Dr. Lionel Croft shot to his feet, his chair toppling over with a crash. His normally composed face was contorted with fury, his voice a sharp bark. This is absurd, he spat. You sile old woman spinning tales out of thin air. Miss Marple, still seated, folded her hands neatly in her lap. She watched him the way a schoolteacher watches a child in the middle of a tantrum. Across the room, Edgar Montague rose, his face dark with barely contained rage, his hands clenched into fists. You let "Come after my girl," he said haily. "You let them think she was a murderer." Harriet clutched her father's arm. "It doesn't matter now," she whispered. "It's over." Croft's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Is it?" he sneered. "You're also willing to believe her little parlor trick. Do you think I was the only one with something to gain?" His gaze snapped to Clarissa Penrose, who had been unnervingly quiet. "Tell me, dear Lady Croft," said voice, dripping with contempt. "Just how long were you planning to let me take the fall alone?" Clarissa stiffened. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward her, observing every small movement. Widow of Eleazar Penrose did not defend herself at once. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against the fabric of her dress. "I had no idea you would go this far," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she noted with quiet interest what Clarissa did not say. She did not say, "I had no idea you would kill him." She did not say, "I had no part in this." She simply said, "Not this far." A sharp knock at the door broke the tense silence. The local inspector stepped in, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. His arrival had not been a coincidence. Miss Marple had sent for him earlier. He took one look at Dr. Croft, still standing, still furious, and let out a weary sigh. "I take it I won't need to ask any questions," he muttered. Miss Marple gave him a small smile. "No, I rather think the good doctor has answered them himself." Croft's shoulders sagged. The fight left him in an instant, as though his mind had caught up with the truth before his pride. He sank back into his chair, his hands rubbing his face. "I never meant for it to go this far," he muttered. "Eleazar wasn't supposed to." His breath hitched. "I only meant to scare him, to get him to keep quiet about the missing money." His voice grew quieter, now duller. "But he threatened to go public. I knew what that would mean." His eyes lifted toward Miss Marple as though resigned to her judgment. "It was easy." He admitted a small alter to his medication. He hardly noticed Clarissa's lips parted, but she said nothing. Croft turned to the inspector. "I suppose you'll find your proof soon enough," he muttered. The inspector nodded to his men, and they moved forward as Croft was led away. Miss Marple watched without triumph, without gloating. Clarissa remained seated, her face blank. The inspector turned to her. "Do you deny knowing about any of this?" Clarissa lifted her chin. "I knew nothing," she said evenly, and yet Miss Marple noticed her hands were still shaking. The inspector hesitated, then sighed. "There's no evidence to charge you, Mrs. Penrose." Clarissa nodded once sharply. Miss Marple said nothing because she knew the truth. Clarissa had not killed her husband, but she had known, and she had done nothing to stop it. The inspector turned to Harriet. "You are free to go, Miss Manu." Harriet let out a small choked sob. Her father pulled her into a fierce embrace for the first time in weeks. The weight had lifted. Miss Marple watched them, a satisfied warmth settling in her chest. Justice had been served, even if some truths would remain unspoken. She picked up her teacup once more, took a small sip, and sighed. Crime, after all, was like a well-brewed cup of tea, best examined carefully, lest one mistake the bitterness for something else entirely. A week had passed, and Westfield on the Green had for the most part settled back into its usual rhythm. The scandal of Alice Penrose's murder and Dr. Croft's downfall had given way to more mundane concerns. The price of butter at the grocer's, the state of the vicar's rose bushes, and Mrs. Bellamy's latest quarrel with the fishmonger. But the village had changed, if only slightly. Harriet Monteith had returned to work at her father's shop, though she no longer moved with the quiet ease she once had. She was polite, but away, her eyes still carrying the shadow of her near ruin. People greeted her warmly now, some guilt-ridden for ever having doubted her. But Miss Jane Marple, watching from her seat by the tier-room window, knew how villages worked. Scandals faded, but they were never truly forgotten. Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw arrived at Miss Marple's table with her usual brisk energy, setting down a fresh cup of tea. "As though bestowing an honor. Well, Jane," she said, folding herself into a chair, "if I haven't heard your name 100 times this week." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "The inspector and the constable both agree." Mrs. Bradshaw went on, "that without you the case would have dragged on for months. she leaned in. Slightly, of course they won't admit that openly. Wouldn't do for the law to rely too much on elderly women. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. No indeed, that would be rather alarming for them. Mrs. Bradshaw chuckled, but the amusement in her eyes quickly faded, replaced by something more pensive. And Clarissa? She asked, voice lowering slightly, as though the mere mention of the name carried weight. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision, aligning it neatly with the saucer before responding. Well, she said thoughtfully, it appears she is leaving. Mrs. Bradshaw sniffed, shaking her head. Not much left for her here, I suppose. The estate of course goes to her. Alistair's fortune as well. But she's shutting up the manor for good. Miss Marple was not surprised. Clarissa had not been charged with any crime. There had been no concrete evidence, no proof that she had played any part in her husband's death. And yet there had been something in her silence that Miss Marple had not been able to ignore. Not guilt, necessarily, but an absence of grief, a hollowness where sorrow should have been. The morning train released a gentle hiss as it idled at the platform, steam curling around the wooden planks like a ghostly whisper. A chill lingered in the air, the kind that spoke of autumn creeping in, though the sun still cast a golden glow over the sleepy little station. Miss Marple stood near the edge, her small suitcase resting at her feet, her posture relaxed but her mind as sharp as ever. It was always strange, she reflected, leaving a place after a crime had been solved. Life would resume as if nothing had happened. Villagers would return to their routines. The scandal would fade into hushed murmurs over afternoon tea. But nothing ever truly went back to the way it was. She thought of Dr. Croft, a man who had been clever but not clever enough, of Sergeant Parker, who had traded his honor for a price he hadn't even lived long enough to spend, and of Clarissa Penrose, a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted, a fortune and freedom. Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the handle of her handbag. Had Clarissa played an active role in her husband's demise, or had she merely watched, calculating, waiting, allowing fate to take its course without ever lifting a finger? That, Miss Marple decided, was the one question she would never have an answer to. A hurried sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Harriet Montague and her father Edgar had arrived at the platform, slightly out of breath. The young woman's face was no longer clouded with fear. Instead there was something else, something quiet but resolute. Miss Marple, Harriet said softly, her voice carrying warmth. Edgar held out a small, neatly wrapped package. His hands were steady, but his eyes shone with emotion. We wanted to give you something," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Miss Marple accepted it with a small nod, her fingers carefully untying the brown paper. Inside was a hand-stitched handkerchief, the initials JM embroidered in delicate blue thread. Harriet bit her lip, watching nervously. "Just a small thank you for everything." For a moment, Miss Marple said nothing. Her fingers brushed over the fine stitches, feeling the care woven into each one. Then she looked up, her expression gentle. "My dear, it is perfect." Her gaze met Harriet's, studying the girl with quiet understanding. "You have a bright future ahead," she said kindly. "You are no longer under suspicion, and suspicion once lifted, makes room for possibilities." Harriet lowered her head slightly, as though absorbing the weight of those words. But there was a flicker of something new in her eyes, a quiet determination, perhaps. A woman stepping out of the shadow of doubt, into a life that was once again her own. The train gave a sharp whistle. Miss Marple turned, stepping onto the carriage, then paused, glancing back one last time. Her eyes met Harriet's, then Edgar's. "Be well," she said simply. As the train lurched forward, she settled into her seat, placing her handbag neatly beside her. She withdrew her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needle soothing in its predictability. Justice, she thought, was never quite as neat as a well-made stitch. There were always loose threads, questions left unanswered, fate sealed by the quiet choices people made in the shadows. Some justice was written in the courts, but some was written in silence, in the knowing glances, in the truths people chose to carry, or forget. And in Westfield on the Green, the truth had been revealed, whether the village chose to remember it or not. The train rumbled along the tracks, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green and gold. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently, methodically. She had done what she came to do, and now it was time to go home.